The night she drove her heel into my dog's ribs, I felt the world collapse. A woman I had never met before, now daring to call herself my daughter-in-law, hurled me out onto the street of a mansion I had built with my husband's sweat and years. She believed I would disappear in silence. But she was wrong. I am still here, alive, and telling you my story. So like this video, share it, and leave a comment below to let me know where in the world you are listening from. I was born into a world where work was survival and silence was often the safest companion, and for many years my life was defined by long days of polishing silver, sweeping marble floors, and tending to the vines that sprawled across the hills of the estate. I was a woman of 60 now, but I still remembered the years when I was just the quiet housekeeper in that grand vineyard mansion, invisible to the guests, yet essential to the rhythm of their lives. What set me apart was not only hard work, but also the way I could read the language of grapes and soil, how I knew the patience of fermentation, and how I poured wine with both grace and knowledge. Slowly, the master of the house, a white man with immense power in the wine industry, began to notice what others dismissed. He asked me about vintages, about soil, about harvest cycles, and in those quiet conversations our worlds drew closer. When his first wife passed away, grief hollowed his eyes, but he also began to lean on me not as a servant, but as a confidant. I never expected what followed, yet he asked me to stand beside him as his wife, and despite the whispers and cold glances of the upper circles, he placed a ring on my finger in front of God and law. That moment rewrote my destiny, turning me from a maid into the legal second wife of a man whose name commanded respect in every vineyard and every auction house. With that title came the heavy mantle of stepmother to his only son, a man who never truly saw me as family, but rather as an intruder who had crossed an invisible line. I carried both pride and unease, knowing that love and resentment could coexist under one roof, and that my story was no longer just about loyalty, but about survival in a world that measured worth by bloodlines and legacy. The years that followed our marriage were not years of ease, but of relentless work, and I remember standing with him under the blazing sun as we walked row after row of vines, our hands stained with soil and juice, our backs aching but our hearts steady. The estate that once seemed quiet and modest began to breathe with new life as we poured every ounce of energy into turning a local vineyard into a name whispered with reverence in fine dining circles. I was not content to remain a silent partner. My eyes measured every grape that was harvested, my palate searched for balance, and it was I who proposed a new method of aging that gave our wines a depth and subtlety that critics would one day celebrate. I spoke with chefs in Michelin-star restaurants, ensuring they understood not just the flavor, but the soul behind each bottle, and I charmed buyers and collectors who valued exclusivity as much as quality. There were nights when exhaustion pressed on my chest like a weight, yet I pushed through because I knew every ounce of persistence would one day be tasted in the glass of someone who mattered. Our wine became more than a drink. It became a symbol of elegance, something people ordered not only to please their tongues, but to mark their place in a circle of refinement. He often told me in private that without my steady vision and persistence, the dream would have remained only a vineyard by the hills. When he drafted his will, he placed the greater part of the shares in my name, believing not only in my loyalty, but in my ability to guard what we had created. To him, I was the one who could defend this legacy from greed and neglect, and though the ink on that document was just strokes on paper, for me it was the weight of trust, responsibility, and a promise that the vineyard would not be betrayed. When my husband passed away, the silence of the villa by the sea felt heavier than any crowd of mourners could ever bring, and instead of flaunting the wealth or power that now rested in my name, I chose to retreat into the quiet rhythm of waves and wind. The villa, worth $50 million, stood like a fortress against the restless ocean, yet inside I lived humbly with only my loyal dog at my side, finding comfort in his steady presence when human voices failed me. I made a deliberate choice to step away from the boardroom and handed the reins of daily operations to his only son, a man whose hunger for control was written in every gesture and word. He walked into meetings with his chest lifted, as though the empire was his by birthright, never questioning the true balance of ownership, never realizing that I still held the controlling shares in silence. In his eyes, I was merely the widow who lingered on the edge of relevance, a woman tolerated but never respected. And he grew bold in his disregard, speaking of me with clipped politeness in public and with cold contempt in private. My silence became his illusion, and his illusion turned into arrogance. I could feel the resentment sharpening in him like a blade, each look he gave me carrying the weight of dismissal, each decision made without my counsel, a declaration that I was nothing more than an ornament of the past. Yet I did not respond. I sat in the garden with my dog at my feet, listening to the crash of waves and the call of gulls, knowing that patience was sometimes sharper than confrontation. The world believed he was the master. He too believed it. But beneath the stillness, I carried the truth like a hidden ember, waiting for the moment when silence itself would speak louder than any words. The first blow came quietly, like a door closing without warning. My stepson married without so much as a phone call, without an invitation, without even a word to acknowledge that I existed. It was a deliberate act, one meant to sever what little thread of family connection still bound us, and though I had prepared myself for his arrogance, the sting of exclusion still burned deep. When I finally saw his new bride, she appeared in the villa with the radiance of youth and beauty, her movements graceful yet sharp with arrogance. She looked at me as though I were part of the staff, an elderly gardener or some retired housekeeper still clinging to the property. Not once did she consider that these walls had been my home, that the villa had witnessed my laughter with her husband's late father, that every stone and every vine carried the weight of my years of devotion. Instead, she tossed her handbag onto the marble table, her voice brisk as she called for water, and when her eyes swept over me there was no recognition, only indifference, perhaps even contempt. My stepson stood by her side with a smirk, proud to parade his conquest, blind to the insult she cast upon me. I felt my heart clench, not out of jealousy but out of sorrow, for the place that had once been a haven of peace with my husband was slowly becoming a battlefield. Every corner of the villa that had sheltered my memories now echoed with disdain. I moved silently through the rooms, still dignified, still holding my head high, yet inside me a storm was forming. It was late in the afternoon when I first heard the pounding of bass, a deep vibration that did not belong to the calm villa by the sea. Before I could even step outside, the front doors swung open, and my daughter-in-law paraded in with a pack of strangers, their laughter spilling into the halls like broken glass. They wore bikinis and swim trunks, carrying bottles of champagne as if they owned the place, and not one of them stopped to ask if they were welcome. Music thundered from portable speakers, the heavy rhythm shaking the crystal chandeliers, and within moments the marble floors were slick with foam as champagne sprayed wildly against the walls and furniture. I stood at the staircase clutching the railing, my chest tight, as the house I had once built into a sanctuary was desecrated before my eyes. The scene grew uglier by the minute. Young men and women leaned across the counters taking body shots, their laughter shrill and careless. A circle formed on the living room rug where they shouted dares, voices rising higher as clothing was cast aside, and soon several of them tore into the garden, stripping bare before plunging into the pool, their bodies flashing beneath the fading light. I wanted to shout, to put an end to it, but my voice caught in my throat as the weight of their disregard pressed harder than any scream. This villa had been where I shared my husband's dreams, where we raised glasses of wine to celebrate milestones, where every painting and every stone held memory. Now it was nothing more than a playground for strangers who treated it like a stage for their recklessness. I retreated a step back, my dog pressed close to my leg, his low growl the only sound of protest. Rage swelled inside me as I watched the house transform into a battlefield of chaos, vowing silently that this humiliation would not go unanswered. I stepped forward from the shadow of the hallway, my hands still stained with earth from the garden, the scent of soil clinging to my palms. I tried to steady my voice, gentle but firm, asking them to please be mindful of the antiques, the wood polished by decades of care, the paintings that had survived generations. For a brief moment the music seemed to lower, and all eyes turned to me. My daughter-in-law narrowed her gaze, her lips curling in a smile that carried no warmth. She tilted her head, and in a tone sharp enough to cut, she called me an old hag who had no place meddling in the affairs of the real owners. The words pierced through me, not because they were clever, but because they were cruel and spoken before an audience eager to laugh. I felt the sting deepen when she lifted her glass of red wine, her eyes locked on mine, and with deliberate malice she flicked her wrist, spilling the liquid across my head. The warmth of the wine soaked into my hair, running down my cheeks and seeping into the fabric of my shirt until I was drenched. A hush fell for a heartbeat. Then the laughter erupted, sharp and merciless, bouncing off the walls of the villa. They pointed, they jeered, their voices rising in a cruel chorus. And in that moment I was not the woman who had once been mistress of this house, but a caricature, a joke in the eyes of strangers standing in the ruins of my dignity. My dog barked and pressed close, as if he alone remembered who I was, while I stood rooted in place, my chest heaving with the weight of humiliation. Yet beneath the sting of wine and shame, something colder began to take shape, a resolve born from silence, promising that this would not be the end of my story. The rag landed at my feet with a wet slap, the smell of spilled wine heavy in the air. My daughter-in-law's voice cut through the noise, commanding me to scrub the floor like a servant, her eyes gleaming with cruelty. For a moment, the weight of humiliation threatened to crush me, but I forced myself to steady my breathing. I bent down, my knees pressing against the cold marble, and picked up the rag. Each stroke across the floor was slow, deliberate, my silence the only shield I had left. I told myself that dignity was not in the words shouted, but in the restraint of one who refused to give her tormentors satisfaction. Around me, laughter rose and fell like waves, mocking my every movement. Then, as though cruelty had no end, she leaned closer, feigning disdain, and said the floor was still dirty. Her voice grew louder, sharp enough to silence even the music, as she accused me of failing even at this menial task. I could feel every eye burning into my back, every sneer cutting into my skin. Finally she straightened, her hand pointing toward the door, and with a triumphant smile declared that I was no longer welcome in this house. The villa that had once been my refuge, the place where I had lived and loved, was stripped from me in that single sentence. Her friends cheered, some clapping, others jeering, while she pressed forward and shoved me toward the entrance like an unwanted guest. My dog barked fiercely, resisting her cruelty, but even his growls were drowned by their laughter. The night air still clung to my skin when I heard a low whimper, and I turned to see my dog circling near the luggage stacked by the door. It was my daughter-in-law's suitcase, sleek leather with golden clasps, untouched by dust, yet my loyal companion would not leave it alone. His nose pressed against the seams, his growl low but persistent, and every few moments he gave a short bark as if warning me of something unseen. At first I thought he was simply restless after the chaos of the party, but the longer I watched, the more certain I became that his behavior carried purpose. My daughter-in-law, still flushed with drink and arrogance, noticed the attention, and her face twisted in irritation. Without hesitation she swung her foot, striking his side with a cruel kick that sent him yelping, stumbling dangerously near the stone steps. My heart jolted, pain slicing through me, and I rushed forward, scooping his trembling body into my arms. His heartbeat fluttered against my chest, and I whispered soft comfort, my eyes wet with fury and fear. Yet even as he quivered in my embrace, his gaze stayed fixed on that suitcase, his body straining as if he would leap again if I let him go. I stroked his fur, trying to calm him, but inside a spark of suspicion lit. Why this suitcase? Why now? Why with such urgency? I inhaled deeply and thought I detected something faint, something out of place, a scent that did not belong to the perfume and fabric of a young bride. I could not name it yet, but the mystery pressed against my thoughts like a shadow on the wall. I held my dog closer, my mind spinning, realizing that sometimes instinct speaks louder than reason, and his refusal to leave that suitcase might be the first thread of a truth waiting to unravel. My dog's body grew limp in my arms, his breath rattling shallow and uneven, each wheeze like a knife to my chest. I cradled him tighter, whispering his name, fear rising until my vision blurred. Behind me, laughter still echoed, cruel and careless, as if his suffering were part of their amusement. I felt the sting of helplessness, but then I noticed movement at the edge of the garden. The old gardener, a man who had served the estate longer than I had lived there, stood quietly with his hat pulled low. His weathered eyes met mine for an instant, and with a subtle nod he beckoned. My heart pounded as I rose, clutching my trembling dog, and followed his steady steps away from the blinding lights of the villa. He led me through a narrow passage hidden by hedges, a path I had never known, until we reached the scent of salt and the creak of ropes swaying in the night wind. There, at the secluded dock, the family's private boat waited, rocking gently against the pier as if it had been prepared for this moment. Without a word, he steadied me, helping me aboard, his hands rough yet reassuring. I laid my dog on a soft blanket, his chest rising and falling with fragile persistence, and pressed my lips against his fur, fighting back tears. The gardener cast off the ropes, the engine stirred, and slowly the yacht slipped from shore. The villa, once my fortress and prison, receded into darkness behind us. I stood at the stern, salt wind on my face, humiliation still burning in my veins, yet beneath it grew a strange calm. I had been cast out, yes, but not defeated. When I finally returned to the main estate, after tending to my injured dog and gathering the strength I thought I had lost, I stepped inside only to feel the air knocked out of me. The grand halls that once breathed with memories were stripped bare of their soul. My belongings, the clothes, the books, the keepsakes that had followed me through decades, were no longer in their places. Instead, they had been shoved into a cramped, dim corner room at the far end of the house, as if I were a guest overstaying her welcome. I walked into the living room and stopped cold. The walls that once displayed portraits of my late husband and our shared history now held only glossy wedding photographs of my stepson and his new bride. Their smiling faces stared down at me like intruders daring me to protest. I turned slowly, searching for the objects that had once given the house its warmth. The first bottle of vintage wine my husband and I had sealed together, the piano where his fingers used to play late into the night, the small trinkets we collected on trips, all of it had vanished. Some pieces were gone entirely, others tossed into storage as if they were meaningless junk. The silence in the house felt foreign, and when I called for the old butler or the maids who had been with us for years, no one came. They had all been dismissed, swept away like the photographs, replaced with strangers, young, brash staff whose stares held neither respect nor loyalty. Their clipped tones and careless movements made it clear they answered only to the newlyweds, not to me. I felt like a shadow walking through my own home, invisible in the place where my heart once lived, and in that moment I understood that this was no longer just cruelty. It was an occupation, a theft of legacy, and I was standing in the ruins of a life they intended to erase. When I returned to the vineyard, the earth that had once breathed life and pride into my days now greeted me with sorrow. I walked between the rows of vines, my loyal dog padding beside me, and the sight broke my heart. Long stretches of grapevines lay bruised and trampled, their branches heavy with fruit that had been left to rot or cut carelessly. Leaves curled in neglect, and the air carried not the sweet fragrance of ripening grapes, but the dull stench of waste. My dog nosed at a pile of discarded clusters, whining, as if he too sensed the insult to what had once been sacred. I entered the winery, and my worst fears unfolded before me. Barrels filled with grapes that should never have been chosen, fruit cheap and inferior, pressed into service for wine that was rushed, aged for only days instead of months, stripped of the patience and craft that had given our bottles their soul. I tasted a drop, and bitterness coated my tongue, coarse and empty, a mockery of what once was. The careful formula my husband and I had refined through years of trial, the delicate balance between soil, grape, and time, had vanished. In its place stood the machinery of haste, the philosophy of profit over pride. The workers, faces unfamiliar and movements sloppy, handled the fruit with no reverence, laughing carelessly as they spilled juice onto the floor. The old vineyard hands, men and women who had walked these rows with me for decades, were gone, dismissed as if loyalty and wisdom had no value. Their replacements were untrained, uninterested, their clumsy hands stripping away the very essence of the brand. My chest ached as I realized this was not mere negligence. It was betrayal, a deliberate sacrifice of legacy for the shallow promise of quick money. I stood in the heart of the vineyard, silence pressing against me, feeling as though the voice of my late husband still lingered in the wind, asking me to defend what we had built before it was lost forever. One evening, while wandering through the study that had once been my husband's sanctuary, I noticed a folder carelessly left half open on the desk. Curiosity and dread mingled in me as I reached for the scattered papers. What I saw made my blood run cold. Balance sheets bled red ink, columns of losses stretching month after month. Contracts revealed loans taken from shadowy creditors, their terms sharp as knives, each clause designed to strangle if a payment was missed. My stepson had slashed prices recklessly, desperate to chase volume, but in doing so he had alienated the loyal clients who once cherished our wine for its prestige. Sales had collapsed, debts had piled, and the company that was supposed to be the jewel of our family legacy was drowning. I turned another page, and my heart sank deeper. Bank statements showed irregular transfers, money funneled out of corporate accounts into platforms I recognized all too well. Cryptocurrency exchanges, risky day trades, and worse, transactions tied to gambling dens that thrived on greed and ruin. My hand trembled as I pieced together the picture. The man who strutted in tailored suits, who hosted parties as if wealth were endless, was not a visionary leader. He was a gambler cloaked in silk, using the company's fortune to patch the holes of his reckless indulgence. The twist was mercilessly clear. Beneath the polished facade, he was dismantling not only the business, but the very foundation of our family. Every signature, every hidden transfer, was another brick torn from the wall of the legacy my husband and I had built. I pressed the papers to my chest, a storm of grief and fury rising within me, knowing that the truth I now held was both a weapon and a curse. I knew the papers I had found were only fragments, shadows of a larger truth, so I sought help from someone whose eyes could pierce through the smoke. The detective I hired was not the kind found in glossy advertisements, but an old hand, a man who had spent decades untangling the secret lives of the wealthy. His manner was discreet, his words measured, yet his resolve carried weight. Within weeks he returned with files thicker than I had feared. He laid them out on my table, page after page of traced transactions, each line a thread leading deeper into my stepson's deception. Cryptocurrency trades leapt off the statements. Wild swings of money moved in and out with reckless abandon. Hidden accounts revealed themselves like stains on white linen, impossible to disguise once exposed. Then came the gambling records, brutal in their clarity. Online poker rooms, digital roulette wheels, endless bets on sports events across continents, all funded from the veins of the company's accounts. The sums were staggering, losses stacked higher than the profits he had once boasted of in public. The detective's voice was steady as he explained, but I barely heard him. My eyes were fixed on the evidence, the naked truth that confirmed what my heart already knew. My stepson was not merely incompetent, he was a parasite feeding on the very inheritance entrusted to him. Every transfer, every late-night wager, was another bite taken from the vineyard's future, from the dreams my husband and I had planted with our hands. I closed the folder slowly, my fingers trembling not with fear, but with resolve. The detective looked at me, waiting for instruction, but inside me the decision was already forming. If he had chosen to gamble away legacy for greed, then it was I who must decide how to protect what remained. The detective's next report was darker than I had braced myself for. He had trailed my daughter-in-law beyond the villa's gates, into the city's glittering skyline where penthouses lit the night like false stars. Behind those glass walls, he uncovered the truth that stripped away her mask of elegance. She was no radiant young bride hosting soirees for friends. She was orchestrating gatherings that shimmered with luxury but reeked of corruption. Women were escorted into the rooms, paraded like rare wines, offered to men whose wallets dictated their appetites. The detective's photographs told the story better than words ever could, her smile at the center of it all, a queen pin disguised as a hostess. On tables lined with crystal, not only champagne flowed, small packets and pills passed from hand to hand, weed smoke curling through the air, and neon lights flashing over faces glazed with intoxication. Clips recorded the laughter, the bargaining, the careless indulgence of men who thought their secrets safe. Then came the list, meticulously gathered, of the guests who attended. Names recognizable in boardrooms, in politics, in philanthropy, men who would crumble if the truth saw daylight. The detective placed the evidence before me, his expression grim. These were not whispers of rumor, but proof, a ticking bomb that could detonate across headlines if released. I sat in silence, my hands pressed to the table, staring at the glossy photos of the woman who had once dismissed me as a relic. She had not only mocked my place in the family, she had stained the name my husband had built with her double life as a madam for the elite. I felt a shiver of both disgust and clarity. The mask had slipped, and beneath it was not a bride but a predator, one whose downfall could be crafted with the very tools she had given me. The memory of that night returned to me like a thread pulling tight. I saw again my loyal dog circling, pawing, and barking at the suitcase, refusing to leave it alone no matter how harshly he was scolded. At the time, I had only sensed something wrong, but now, with the detective's findings in hand, the picture came into focus. He confirmed that the very suitcase my daughter-in-law guarded so fiercely had been used to smuggle a carefully concealed package of weed, hidden deep within layers of silk dresses and perfumes. It was not clumsy storage, but deliberate disguise, meant to pass unnoticed among the glittering luggage of a wealthy bride. My dog's nose, sharp as truth itself, had uncovered what human eyes would have overlooked. I looked down at him as he rested his head on my lap, his breath steadier now after weeks of care, and felt a wave of gratitude. He had not only defended me with loyalty, but had also become the silent witness to a secret that could expose everything. In that moment, I realized he was more than a companion. He was a key, the missing piece that validated the evidence we had gathered. Every bark, every growl, every moment of defiance by that suitcase was not mere instinct, but testimony. The detective nodded gravely, saying that in court or in the public eye, even the smallest thread could unravel an entire tapestry of lies. I stroked the soft fur behind his ears, whispering thanks, while inside me grew a fierce certainty. What had begun as humiliation and exile was shifting into power. The truth was assembling itself piece by piece, and at its center stood my faithful dog, the guardian of memory and the unwitting keeper of justice. I sat at my desk long into the night, the quiet broken only by the shuffle of papers and the steady breath of my dog curled at my feet. The detective had delivered stacks of evidence, and I instructed him to compile everything into a single arsenal: loan contracts, bleeding debt, transfers into cryptocurrency accounts, gambling records, photographs of the hidden parties, and clips that left no room for denial. Each piece was a weapon, and together they formed a case no one could dismiss as rumor or spite. I called my private lawyer, a man who had stood beside my husband in countless negotiations, and his calm voice assured me that the documents could be shaped into a flawless legal file, airtight and admissible. Meanwhile, I placed a quiet trust in a woman introduced by the detective, someone who slipped into my daughter-in-law's circle as a glamorous patron. From within, she collected whispers, receipts, and invitations, proof that the debauchery was not a single mistake, but a pattern of rot. Days stretched into weeks, and I kept my silence, walking through the estate as though resigned, never betraying the storm brewing beneath. Outwardly, I was the forgotten widow, tolerated but irrelevant, yet inwardly I traced every step of the plan. I knew the shareholders would gather at year's end, their eyes hungry for profit, their ears open to truth when profit was threatened. That was the moment I prepared for, the stage upon which their arrogance would collapse under the weight of undeniable evidence. I looked toward the vineyard under the moonlight, the vines bruised but not dead, and I whispered to myself that this was no longer about revenge alone. It was about survival, legacy, and justice that would speak louder than all their cruelty. The conference hall shimmered with chandeliers, polished oak tables, and rows of velvet chairs, the kind of stage designed to impress both shareholders and the waiting press. I entered quietly, taking my seat toward the back, my presence unnoticed among the sea of expensive suits and glimmering jewelry. My stepson strode to the front in a tuxedo tailored within an inch of perfection, his chin lifted high, every movement rehearsed to radiate control. Beside him, my daughter-in-law glowed in a gown studded with crystals, basking in the attention as though she were royalty presiding over her kingdom. Their smiles were wide, their voices brimming with promises. They spoke of expansion, of opening new markets abroad, of record revenues that would eclipse all competitors. Words like legacy and innovation spilled from their mouths, dressed up as if ambition could erase debt. The audience responded with polite applause, a rhythm more obligatory than inspired, yet I caught the flicker of doubt in the eyes of those who had weathered decades of boardroom battles. Men and women who had once toasted with my husband shifted uneasily in their seats, their gazes narrowing at the grand claims. They sensed what others could not yet see, that beneath the glitter and bravado, cracks were forming in the foundation. My daughter-in-law leaned forward against the podium, her tone dripping with arrogance as she gestured toward slides of champagne glasses and luxury estates, as if extravagance itself was proof of success. My stepson clasped her hand dramatically, the gesture meant to symbolize strength and unity, but to me it was a mask, stretched too tight to hide desperation. I sat still, my hands folded, waiting. Every lie they told now only tightened the noose they had tied around themselves, and the room, though dazzled by light, was already beginning to feel the weight of shadow. The lights dimmed as the projector hummed to life, casting bright images onto the wide screen. It was then that the sound of measured footsteps echoed against the marble floor, drawing every head toward the back of the hall. I entered slowly, clad in a tailored suit of deep navy silk, my hair pinned neatly, my expression serene. The room stilled. For months they had treated me as though I were invisible, the forgotten widow tucked away in the shadows. Yet here I was, walking with calm authority into the heart of their spectacle. My stepson froze mid-sentence, his jaw tightening before he forced a smile, but his eyes betrayed the flicker of unease. My daughter-in-law let out a brittle laugh, raising her champagne glass as though to greet me, yet the slight tremor in her hand and the sheen of sweat on her brow told the truth. I reached the front rows and paused, allowing the silence to stretch. Every gaze in the room now weighed on me, confusion mingling with curiosity. I placed a hand gently on the polished table, my rings catching the dim light, and in a voice steady and clear, I asked to speak, not as a guest, but as the majority shareholder of the company. A gasp rippled through the hall, papers rustling as disbelief spread among the crowd. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching, while seasoned investors exchanged sharp glances. The illusion of control my stepson and his bride had built cracked audibly, their performance collapsing under the weight of my words. I did not raise my tone. I did not need to. Authority came not from volume, but from truth and presence, and in that moment the power in the room shifted quietly, decisively, into my hands. The lights flickered as I pressed the remote, and the screen behind me burst alive with images no one in that room expected. At first came the footage from the villa, the raucous party they thought was hidden forever. Faces appeared in high definition, my daughter-in-law laughing as she poured red wine over my head, her friends shrieking as they stripped and plunged naked into the pool. Gasps spread like wildfire, the sound of shock cutting through the hall. I let the images linger, then advanced to the next blow. Pages of debt flashed across the screen, contracts signed with banks, numbers bleeding into the millions. Then came the gambling slips, online poker records, and cryptocurrency transfers, each document stamped and authenticated, undeniable proof that my stepson was siphoning the company's fortune into smoke and ruin. The room shifted, shareholders leaning forward, their faces pale, their whispers sharp with outrage. But I was not finished. I signaled the detective, and the final sequence rolled. Photographs of penthouse nights, women lined up like commodities, my daughter-in-law smiling at the center, her glass raised in triumph. Clips revealed packets of pills, trails of smoke, and the guest list glowing with the names of powerful men. The evidence was ironclad, each frame a blade striking deeper. The press surged to capture it, cameras flashing like lightning in a storm, while seasoned investors turned visibly ill at the sight of their supposed leaders. My stepson slumped in his chair, his face drained of color, and my daughter-in-law's practiced smile finally shattered into panic. The hall buzzed with disbelief, horror, and the dawning realization that the empire they had claimed as theirs was now unraveling before every witness dot. The uproar had not yet settled when the heavy doors swung open and uniformed officers strode inside, their badges gleaming beneath the chandeliers. A hush fell over the room, broken only by the clicking of cameras as the lead officer announced a warrant for my daughter-in-law's arrest. The words sliced through the air like thunder. She staggered back, mascara streaking as tears poured down her cheeks. Her cries filled the hall, claiming innocence, blaming conspiracies. Yet her wrists were pulled forward and bound in cold steel for every shareholder, every journalist, every camera to see. The room erupted, some gasping, others whispering, all bearing witness to a downfall that no lie could repair. My stepson crumbled where he stood, the tuxedo that once made him proud now hanging loose on a body bent with shame. He fell to his knees before me, his voice breaking, begging me to save him from ruin, from debt, from the stain that now clung to his name. His hands clutched at mine, desperate, trembling, but I remained still. My eyes, steady and cold, met his without pity. I gave no answer, no promise, no comfort. Instead, I allowed the silence to stretch, heavy and unrelenting, so that every person in that hall could see the truth. The heir who once mocked me, who stripped me of dignity, was stripped now of his own power, left exposed and powerless at my feet. Around us, the flashes continued, immortalizing the moment. The empire they thought untouchable had collapsed in the full glare of justice, and I stood in the center not as victim, but as witness, letting the weight of silence deliver the final verdict. The scene unfolded like a play stripped of glamour. My daughter-in-law, once radiant in sequins and jewels, now stood in the harsh light of disgrace, her wrists bound in steel, her sobs echoing against the walls. Mascara streaked down her cheeks in dark rivers, her hair clinging to her face as she screamed for mercy. Cameras clicked furiously, flashes exploding like firecrackers, capturing every tear, every desperate glance. Within minutes, the footage was already spreading across social media and news outlets, her fall from grace broadcast to the world. The same society that once invited her to soirees and praised her elegance now recoiled, eager to distance itself from the scandal. Whispered judgments cut sharper than blades. She was no longer the glittering bride of a wealthy heir, but a madam exposed, a fraud who had used the family name to mask her depravity. Those who had once clinked glasses in her presence now pretended they had never known her, their eyes sliding away in cold denial. She stumbled as the officers led her forward, the weight of her own collapse dragging at her steps, and the silence that followed her cries was more damning than words. For years she had worn arrogance like a crown, mocking, dismissing, strutting through halls that were never hers. Now her crown lay shattered, replaced with the looming shadow of a prison cell and a sentence that would strip away the last of her illusions. Dot. The room was still vibrating with the echoes of scandal when the chairman of the board called for an emergency vote. Papers rustled, voices sharpened, and within minutes the atmosphere turned from shock to judgment. The shareholders, once eager to flatter my stepson, now spoke with icy disdain. They cited his reckless loans, the shattered reputation of the brand, and the disgrace his wife had dragged into the company's name. One by one, hands were raised, the verdict unanimous and swift. He was stripped of his position, his title torn away in front of the cameras, his face drained of color, eyes darting in panic as the very men who once praised his vision now called him a saboteur, an heir who had betrayed the trust of his lineage. The walls of support he had built with charm and arrogance collapsed into dust. No ally remained, no partner offered defense. The board's declaration sealed his fate, leaving him not with power, but with the mountain of debts he had created, debts that now hung around his neck like chains. He lowered his head, his shoulders sagging, the tuxedo that had once symbolized his triumph now only a costume of humiliation. In that moment, the heir was no more. What remained was a man stripped bare, isolated, exposed, his legacy reduced to whispers of failure and disgrace. I rose from my chair, the weight of silence pressing against me, yet my steps were steady as I moved toward the center of the room. My voice, calm but edged with steel, carried through the hall as I declared that this company did not belong to traders of blood, but to those who honored and protected its legacy. The words rang against the walls, clear and final, and for a long moment no one moved. Then, like a tide breaking free, the sound of applause erupted. It was not polite clapping, but thunderous, unanimous, a chorus of recognition. Faces that had once looked past me now turned toward me with respect, eyes gleaming with relief as though they had been waiting for this moment. Shareholders, both old and new, leaned forward to pledge their support, acknowledging that only I held the knowledge, the patience, and the unwavering loyalty to restore what had been lost. The vote came swiftly, every hand raised in agreement, their decision carrying not hesitation but certainty. My heart ached as I thought of my husband, of the vineyard we had built with sweat and love, and I knew he would have stood by me in this hour. As I looked across the hall, I saw not scorn, not pity, but admiration. In their gaze, I was no longer the stepmother dismissed as irrelevant, no longer the woman mocked and humiliated. I had become something more, a symbol of resilience, of wisdom sharpened by hardship, of strength born from betrayal. The crown they had tried to strip from me had returned, not of jewels, but of respect, and it sat firmly on my head as I stood unbowed before them all. My stepson collapsed before me, the proud posture he had worn for years broken into dust. His knees hit the floor, his head bowed, and the sound of his sobs filled the silent chamber. Tears streamed down his face, dripping onto the polished marble, and for the first time since his childhood, he looked not like an heir, but like a boy lost in the storm of his own making. His voice cracked as he begged me to save him, to pull him back from the abyss of debts and disgrace that had swallowed his name. The hall held its breath, every shareholder, every journalist waiting for my response. Yet I gave none. I stood still, my eyes fixed on him, cold and unyielding, letting silence weigh heavier than 1,000 refusals. He lifted his face then, and in my gaze he saw the truth he had long denied, that the woman he mocked, dismissed, and humiliated was the only foundation left to him. His shoulders shook as realization carved through his pride. Slowly I spoke, my words deliberate. I told him I would allow a chance, but only under conditions that demanded full repentance, transparency, and humility. He would work not as a master, but as a servant of the legacy, stripped of privilege until he proved himself worthy. If he failed, there would be nothing left, no safety net, no return. His nod was faint, broken by sobs, but it was the first gesture of surrender I had ever seen from him. And in that fragile moment, I knew the wheel of fate had turned, not because of vengeance alone, but because of justice demanding its due. The vineyard stretched before me, bathed in the golden glow of sunset, every row shimmering with light, as if the earth itself exhaled relief after the storm. The clusters of grapes, ripe and purple, gleamed with quiet promise, and I walked slowly among them with the leash in my hand. My dog trotted at my side, his gait steady once more, his injuries long healed, the soft jingling of his collar the only rhythm to the silence. No voices of scorn, no laughter of cruelty remained, only the whisper of wind moving through the vines, closing the chapter of chaos that had haunted these fields. I paused, tilting my head toward the vast horizon, and within the stillness, my own voice rose in thought. I could forgive, but I would never forget. Justice had been restored, the truth laid bare, yet a hollow space lingered, one not easily filled. A question pressed against my heart, one that had no simple answer. Did revenge truly bring happiness, or did it only stitch wounds with threads too fragile to last? I breathed deeply, the scent of grapes mingling with the fading day, and I knew that what carried me through was not fury alone, but the patience and wisdom earned through years of being underestimated. Turning back toward the path, I let my words reach beyond the vines, beyond the hills, to those who might listen. If you have ever witnessed betrayal within your family, share your story. Each truth spoken can become strength for another woman standing where I once stood. Like share, leave a comment about where you are listening from. Let us weave a tapestry of connection across the world. We may grow older, but the strength in our hearts will never run dry.